Hey there, welcome back to Boldest, your go-to place for all things women in business, career development, as well as consulting. So last week, I finally launched the Be Boldest Instagram page where I share all types of resources as well as features of inspirational women in my life. So if you're interested in this type of content, you can definitely check out the page at be.boldest. So today I'm back with a highly requested and awaited video as part of my Consulting Recruitment Exposed series, and that's consulting case interviews. So I want to start off by saying that there is so much content online regarding case prep and case interviews. A lot of ex-consulting practitioners have gone ahead and created YouTube channels and websites with a bunch of resources that specifically focus on nailing the case interview. So the idea with this video is not necessarily to compete with the resources that are out there because they're extremely comprehensive, but rather add my element of analysis and my experience so that you can really step up your case interview game. So a couple of these resources are casecoach.com, which is amazing. There's also Victor Cheng here on YouTube. You can read a classic, The Case in Point book, although I do recommend, practice over simply reading a book. You can check on the company websites that you're applying to. So McKinsey, BCG, Deloitte, PwC, EY, all of these companies have amazing resources, amazing practice cases on their websites that you can use to prep yourself. And then also you can use just the internet and YouTube as an amazing resource in order to learn about some of these things, watch some practice interviews, and just get to know and understand what the different frameworks and structures are. So in order to structure this video, I'm going to focus on a couple of tips that you can use in order to level up your case interview game. And this will be broken down into three main sections. So first are the sort of beginner tips, the checkboxes that you need in order to, just get noticed and get considered in the interview. Next, there's going to be the more intermediate portion, things that are going to help you stand out and really set you apart from the pack. And then finally, there's more of the advanced, and these are the elements that if you bring to the table are really going to make you that superstar candidate that any company would love to have. The first thing that you need to understand is the context of the interview. The first thing within this is to not think that the interviewee is trying to trick you. And this is something that comes up a lot when you hear about, market sizing examples or even just tricky questions that you could get asked in extremely stressful situations within these case interviews. The best way to approach the case interview is going into it thinking that it's simply a brainstorming session for a new client that you and your colleague, aka the interviewer, are trying to come up with ideas for or coming up with a straw man for a deck. And a typical question that might make you think that they're trying to trick you is the "are you sure" question. So you go through an entire analysis or you'll come up with a number and they'll ask you, "Are you sure?" maybe once or twice or three times. And they just want to make sure that you have the conviction to stand behind your analysis, and that if you realize that you're wrong, that you're able to admit so, go back, redo the work to come up with the right answer again. You have to understand that, as I've mentioned before, the interviewer isn't an HR person. It's someone within the team who's taking time out of their crazy day to interview you and maybe like 3, 4, 5 other candidates, which is, a couple of hours that they're going to have to make up for at the end of their day. So with that in mind, how can you make it interesting for them? Also, something that people don't understand is that case interviews are kind of like a hard skill. They aren't based on just your ability to do analytical thinking here and there and to just come up with good ideas. This is something that you actively prepare for multiple months leading up to these interviews. Thus, you have to be cognizant that you are being graded on an actual grading scheme, whether the person has it in front of them or not. And although this might change from firm to firm, these are typically based on structure, analytical ability, general presence, quantitative ability, aka math and analysis, professionalism, and clarity. The first section that I want to discuss is sort of the beginner level checkbox that you need to tick off in order to even get considered. The single most important component of any case interview is structure. And this is why I say I'm obsessed with structure. My obsession actually started when I started case prepping like 2-3 years ago. So the first element of structure that you should always make sure you have is a clear problem statement. So after the interviewers read you the prompt and then you've summarized it, you need to make sure that you know exactly what you're solving for or what the problem you're trying to respond to is. Put it at the top of your white sheet and then clearly identify it so that you can always go back to it whenever you feel lost within the interview. This will essentially set the foundation for your decision tree. And let me tell you, decision trees are about to become your best friend. So a decision tree is a chart that's used to show statistic probability, and in the context of a case interview, it's used to show all of the different buckets and sub-buckets that you can use to build out your structure or your answer to the case. Bucketing is really important for 3 reasons. First of all, if you bucket adequately, it'll allow the interviewer to follow your train of thought much more easily. Next, it allows you to stay on track and really focused, which is extremely important in a high stress and high stakes environment like a case interview. Bucketing also helps structure creativity. If you're asked to come up with a long list of multiple elements in something, it's much easier to do so if you have subcategories that you're coming up with the ideas in. Let me explain. If you're asked to come up with different types of ice cream flavors and you just start rattling them off in no particular order, you'll run out of ideas very quickly because your brain isn't able to just come up with them all at once. However, if you're able to break them down into different categories, aka fruit flavors, classic flavors, new flavors, something like that, whatever tickles your fancy, you're gonna be able to keep it going and come up with much more ideas within each of them. Obviously, ice cream flavors is a silly example, but if you're trying to come up with some marketing ideas or some revenue streams, this can be extremely helpful. You always have to make sure that these buckets that you come up with are MECE. MECE is a classic consulting jargon word that essentially means mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And this means that each of the different buckets stand alone and have no overlap with any of the other buckets, but that together make up all the possibilities that could be on the table. For example, if you're thinking of the different meals in a day, you would have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They're all completely different, they all happen at different times in the day, but together make up all of the different eating meals that you could potentially have. However, if you added brunch into the mix, that wouldn't be mutually exclusive because there is overlap between breakfast and lunch, aka brunch. I do recommend looking this up because it's an extremely important concept in the world of consulting. So the last element of the case interview that really requires structure is the quantitative component. Instead of going straight into mental math, you should always come up with a formula and note exactly what X you're trying to solve for so that you can validate this with the interviewer beforehand. Or else what ends up happening is you go down a rabbit hole of calculations and mental math in a very stressful situation without actually knowing if you're solving for the right thing. I can tell you that learning how to become really good at structuring within the case interview has been one of the best things I've ever done for both my career and in my personal life. So the second component that you need when it comes to checking those basic boxes within case interviews is knowing your basic frameworks. And I want to put a disclaimer here that you should not be simply throwing out frameworks at every problem that's given to you. The interviewer is ultimately trying to figure out if you have good analysis and problem-solving capabilities, not if you can regurgitate a simple framework. However, if you know these frameworks going into it, they'll help structure your practice and help you know where to look when you're given certain types of problems. So if you research the resources I mentioned previously, you'll realize that some of these basic frameworks are profitability cases, market analysis cases, market estimation cases, value chain, M&A, and the list goes on. There's about 5 to 10 depending on which resources you look at. These can be a really good starting point to become fluent in the case interview process. And the last basic element that you need to be really good at going into case interviews is mental math. So this is one of the most nerve-wracking portions of the whole case interview prep process because a lot of people haven't done mental math since they were like in primary school. So consulting firms test for mental math because they need to make sure that if you're in a room with a client and a bunch of other consultants and there's a change to the type of assumptions that they have in a revenue model or in a budget, for example, you won't be the only person who doesn't understand the ramifications of this change on the project. Mental math is simply something that the interviewer is trying to check off and you need to meet it to a certain threshold, but it doesn't really matter if you're like exceptional at mental math. You just want to be able to come into it and not worry about the mental math component so that you can focus on analysis and leadership and showing how you're different from other candidates. So what type of math? Well, simple addition, subtraction, multiplication, as well as division. And for this, I recommend downloading a mental math app on your phone. And whenever you have a couple of minutes free or you're waiting for something, just practice and you'll see your skills go up pretty quickly. You should also be really good with percentages. For example, figuring out what 15% of 300 million is. Finally, something that can be really helpful for you is relearning scientific notation so that you make sure that you're not missing missing any zeros in those high number calculations. So now going into the intermediate level, if you will, so these are the elements that are going to make you stand out of the pack a little bit more. So the first thing that you want to do is have a so what for everything. Whenever you come up with any structure, any number, or any analysis whatsoever, you should always go ahead and explain why this matters in the context of the case or for the company that you're doing the prompt for. Every sentence that you say in that interview should be intentional, impactful, and really provide additional value specifically to the case that you're completing. And if you don't do this, they will ask you to, but a good consultant always knows when to give the so what or the key takeaway without having to be told. Second, don't underestimate how much practice you're gonna need in order to get to a level where you're comfortable passing a lot of case interviews. These can be extremely stressful situations, and you have to get used to actually being interviewed by someone who's not necessarily going to push you along like your mother would, for example. Get a case interview buddy as soon as you can, and to do that you can just reach out to people at school who are also looking to get into consulting, or you could check out on LinkedIn, for example, if you can see if people are trying to get into that field. Also, plan out a schedule. This isn't just something that you can do for 1 to 2 hours a week at random times. This will most likely be a multiple month process, so you should set yourself some clear milestones of when you want to do mock interviews with a consultant, for example, just to keep yourself accountable to moving forward in this process. Finally, something that's going to set you apart from other candidates is knowing your basic stats and trends in the market. You should be pretty comfortable with the general population and demographic stats of major countries or countries that you're in. So Canada, if you live here, the US, China, India, and any major developing economies. You should strive to understand general age breakdowns, urbanization rates, major trends, and just try to understand how these different countries operate so that if you're asked a question or a prompt about another country, you won't be completely in the dark. This will also really impress the interviewer because it will show that you can think outside the interview bubble and actually bring outside knowledge into the interview. So now let's talk about the different elements that you can bring to the table to make sure that you are a superstar, standout candidate when it comes to consulting case interviews. So the first element that you want to think of here is to be genuine. And I know this might seem self-explanatory, but this is much harder than it seems when you're in an extremely stressful situation and you have a lot of different things to keep in mind. Regardless of how much you've practiced or how much you know the intricacies of the industry you're being asked about, show that you're invested, you're curious, and you're enthusiastic. At the end of the day, consulting firms just want people who get excited and are able to take initiative. So if all else fails, just be super honest and yourself. This will ultimately lead to the interviewer getting invested in you because they like you and they see how badly you want this, which can do a lot in terms of pushing you forward throughout the process. So the second thing that you can do in order to be a superstar candidate in a case interview is to bring in storytelling and outside insights. As much as possible, you want to bring your various knowledge of industries and sectors and functions to the table to show that you're able to synthesize information effectively. Use your personal experiences to buff up your analysis and show that you're relatable, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make a conversation or a case solve interesting. As a consultant, you're constantly going to be operating in different industries and on different projects, and you need to be able to show that you can take the knowledge that you gain within each of these and bring them to your next project so that not all is lost. Additionally, show judgment. You need to understand when a number is a little or a lot, or when something seems completely crazy. Internally sanity check anything that you say or that you produce within the interview to make sure that it actually makes sense. Finally, the last piece of advice to be a superstar candidate is to know what you don't know. When it comes to cases, a lot of them are formulaic and will end up having similar structures or similar components. You need to understand the questions that you should ask, either to stand out or just to be able to solve the case. By practicing cases, you'll understand what the full picture should be, and you'll understand what you need to look for in order to be able to solve it in the best possible way. If you know what to look for, you won't spend any time going down dead-end paths, and you'll be able to actually focus on building a personal connection with the interviewer, which will ultimately make them remember you. So thank you so much for watching until the end. I gathered all of this advice from being an interviewee and now becoming an interviewer. So this is what I tend to look for and what I wish I knew before getting into the process. I really hope you find this helpful, and if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me either on Instagram or simply through the YouTube platform. If you like my content, you can go ahead and subscribe. I post weekly and mostly business related videos. Cheers! Thanks!